Just take down the live Twitch. Oh, wait. No, I'm seeing something. Yeah, it looks like we're good.
Okay, there we go.
I see us. We exist.
Okay, there we go. All right, sweet. We do. We exist. I exist. I
I have
think.
a, I have a
Therefore, I
pulse.
am.
I don't know. People think, or I mean, people exist, but they sure don't think
Yeah.
anymore. It's a whole other.
Yeah, for real. Okay, we're live on YouTube and Twitch. Confirmed. Okay, let's get into it, man. What do you want to start with?
I don't really care, to be honest. They're both kind of fun and can go either way. Probably would want to put out the census one first. I'm assuming just because it's into that week. It's been a week type of thing.
Let's start with that. Let's just start with that. Then let's go chronological. Let's do the census, redistricting, and all that, and then we'll go into just like anywhere we want to go with wedge issues and stuff.
Absolutely, that sounds good to me.
Cool, man. You wanna intro this one? I'll intro Wedge.
Sounds good to me. That's what I was thinking.
Dope,
Got
man.
it down.
Dope, man. Okay, so now, all right. Let me know when you're good to go.
I think so. Juicy J Caint.
Let's
do it.
Recording in 3, 2, 1.
Last week, the U.S. released the 2020 census, and it was the 24th one, I believe, since 1790. And there were some interesting things that came out of this census. It showed the slowest population growth potentially in U.S. history, but it also moved several electoral and congressional seats in places like California and New York to red and purple states like Arizona, Texas, and Florida. Now there's lawsuits about the accuracy of the census. Democrats underperformed, in a special election in Texas, and critics of this census think that minorities were undercounted and underrepresented. So, Drew, how's it going, man?
Good, man. Good. I'm doing well. It's getting hot here in California, at least down where I am. I'm ready for the summer. But yeah, I mean, the census, it's a big deal. It happens every 10 years. And obviously last year was 2020, which was a strange year to do a census, right? A strange time to force people to walk to other people's doors and have them fill out things in the midst of a pandemic. It was a little weird. So, there was a lot of discussion around the census, and there was a politicized issue around the native citizenship question on the census. So back in 2020, there was a lot of interesting conversation around it, which we covered a little bit of. But now that we have the results of the census and it's actually leading to changes in representation in government, I think now things are really heating up about, do people feel this was a fair census, a full census? I mean, if that can even exist at all. And what does it mean for politics going forward, or what are Democrats and Republicans going to do as a result of this? So yeah, I'm ready to dive in it, but I will say though that political scientists actually aren't that shocked. I think a lot of people see these results and think that there's this massive red wave coming or something like that. But I think that for those that follow demographic shifts and movements in politics, we're not actually seeing anything too outside of what was expected.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. And I like what you said about, how some people say, like, was this an accurate census or not? It's like, I feel like that would be a hard thing to actually figure out, because it's true. Like, how accurate is every census? That's something I don't know. I am definitely not a statistician involved with that stuff, but I think that is a generally broad and good question to be used. But anyways, let's just dive into kind of the background of this census. Texas gained 2 more seats in Congress, or 2 more votes in Congress and the Electoral College for the next decade. Colorado, Florida, Montana, North Carolina, and Oregon each gained 1 seat. And California, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia all lost a seat. So there's clearly been some reshuffling. To be completely honest, I'm not totally surprised about California and Texas specifically, because California has seen not a decline, but somewhat of a no net gain in terms of population, in terms of other years and compared. And a lot of people have gone to other states. And the pandemic kind of began that movement of people out of urban areas. So I'm not really particularly surprised that Texas gained 2 more votes, to be honest. But what are your thoughts kind of on this initial just outcome?
Yeah, I mean, the California, like the increase in Texas is what I expected. I mean, even just anecdotally, I know multiple people that have moved from California to Texas. Now that is anecdotal, but if you look at trends, a lot of people figured Texas was going to grow. It grew 4 million people in the last 10 years, um, and and I think the expectation was that California would not gain a seat. I don't know if people knew that like it was going to lose a seat per se, but it certainly wasn't going to gain a seat. I think that is because of how expensive California is. I think it's fair to criticize that. Yeah, it's expensive to move to California. It's expensive to live in California, and a lot of people have decided to move to other states to live cheaper. And Texas is one of them. And a lot of people are doing that. I'm interested to see, though, that there is not a gain in Arizona. Like, there's a couple other states where I'm like, huh, and I think a lot of other analysts had expected more out of, like, Arizona growing. New York is really interesting because they lost their seat by only, like, 89 people. So that easily could have been an accounting error. Not saying it was. I'm definitely not saying it was, but it easily could have been the idea that, hey, maybe 100 people just didn't fill out the census, and now you lose an entire congressional seat, right? So that's got to be frustrating for people in New York to lose a seat by 89 people. But I think one is there's a couple things to look at here, and I definitely want to start out that we have to first eliminate some of the narratives I'm seeing like on YouTube posts. Like I see a ton of people that are saying like, this proves that Joe Biden didn't win because red states are gaining and blue states are declining. How does that? And it's like, okay, first of all, not every person that's moving to these states is automatically a Republican or a Democrat. Two is, the way the census operates is nothing like how voting works. Like I saw one person say, how can they get a census wrong but then say that the 2020 was the most accurate or super accurate? Again, two different agencies, two different means of counting things completely. Like, like one has a polling system with thousands of poll workers at each poll site, whereas census is done completely differently every 10 years. So I just want to start by getting away from some like narratives that are saying that this is somehow a red wave or something, that it's like, okay, let's look at some stuff first before we just start assuming that Republicans are just growing in numbers and Democrats are declining. I don't think that's actually the case.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. And to be completely honest, like I have no evidence to back this up, but to me, at least from what I've been reading and seeing, it seems like the election was actually probably more secure than this census in a lot of ways. Like in terms of actually getting good data out there. You know what I mean? Like it seems like there's more questions for a rational person involving the census than the election, I guess is what I mean. But I am not going to go down that rabbit hole right now until maybe a little later, but we'll see. But yeah, I agree with you as well, is that just because a state gained a seat or two doesn't just mean out of nowhere that it's going Republican.
Right.
Anecdotally, again, like a lot of the people that I also know a decent amount of people that have moved to Texas and Florida, like specifically. And these people are not some, MAGA hat wearing Trump supporter.
Right.
They're usually a little more centrist or maybe even libertarian leaning. Because like, at least again, anecdotally, for me, it seems like a lot of people were kind of disheartened by the pandemic and also some of these like big government responses in states like California. And a lot of people said like, if it's going to be expensive and I can't work and other states are open, like this is a discussion our family needs to have.
Yeah.
And like, so to me, it just seems like, yeah, exactly. Like to me, it seems like a lot more moderates are actually going to these states than just like far right or far left people. And so it kind of makes this a more complicated thing. And I just want to say, like, initially, I don't think just because Florida or Texas or Colorado gained a seat, it doesn't mean that it's just going to become a right-wing haven,
Right. Now, it does put Republicans in a better position in the midterms. Let's be real, right? So, like, again, the flip side is, yeah, I mean, there are now more seats to be had in Republican-leading states. And the issue I want to get to next is who decides what the district looks like. So it certainly isn't like Texas and Florida, certainly is advantageous for Republicans. They already did better than expected in 2020 with the House, even though the Democrats maintained control of the House, not by much. They are looking better to take back the House of Representatives in the 2022 midterm. It's something that happens a lot in midterms anyway, right? If you have like a full party government, usually in the midterms, it swings back to the other, at least in the House. We see that all the time. And so this does put Republicans in a better position to take back the House in 22. I think it's highly likely they will. So certainly the short term, certainly in the short term to the midterms, I could see a Republican strategist being like, ooh, sweet, we picked up some seats. But this does not mean that this applies to a long-term trend as like overall public policy positions, or even like we said, like it doesn't mean that these are red states forever now. I mean, the Democrat, like just because Texas is gaining people they could be gaining a lot of left-leaning people or moderate people that might, like Matthew McConaughey. And so then, but then let's get into, the other thing that's important to remember is the census decides, okay, now you have to, like we've decided, like based on the numbers, this state requires more representatives. But now it's up to the legislature in the state or sometimes a third-party commission to draw that district. They actually have to draw the district out. They have to figure out, how do we fit this guy in? And so that figuring out that puzzle piece often is left to the legislature, and the legislature in Texas and Florida and among others is very Republican. So there's a high chance that these districts will be gerrymandered to be Republican.
Right. And that is a serious concern because I just remember seeing Dan Crenshaw, Houston representative, someone who's definitely soured in my opinions over the last year. But if you look at his district, it is like it looks like a mountain range out of Switzerland.
I want to see it. Let's demonstrate.
Yeah, pull that up. Like it looks like it was doctored. Like,
oh yeah.
I'm not much of a tinfoil hat guy, but yeah, it was clearly not just proportionally developed. But look at that thing.
Yeah, so Texas District 2, it's like, okay, so it's part of Houston, goes up around the left, all the way around the airport, and then over here in this area. Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that there's an intent, right? The intent is probably to those are probably wealthier, whiter suburbs of Houston that he can hold handedly, and they probably avoid lower income, more minority-based districts. That's, so like. To someone that follows politics, this is like politics 101. But to someone who's not familiar, this is why you can never get out an incumbent in some of these districts, is because the legislature is given the legal authority to draw the district, and they're going to draw it in a way that keeps them in power.
Right, and that's, I think, the big question here, is because I remember reading an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, about the 2010 census, and Texas gained 4 seats, and it was mainly because of Hispanic voters and Hispanic growth. Yet no Hispanic members were added to the congressional delegation because districts were basically just like redrawn to diminish the power of these communities because they were all either lumped into different ones, separated, whatever like that. And so that, to me, actually, if I had one big like fascinating take from this 2020 census, would be that we're seeing something interesting is these states where like that either gained a seat, except for Arizona, because Arizona, Texas, and Florida, they have large percentages of Latino voters. Texas, I want to say, is like, according to the Washington Post, it's 40% in Texas, 26% in Florida, and 32% in Arizona. And so I would imagine these numbers have grown since the 2010 census.
Right.
And the thing is that there's an argument that these people were underrepresented. And so, because of what you mentioned earlier, the citizenship question. And so then it brings up kind of this 2010 issue again, which is so basically Trump, wanted to push for having a question like, are you a citizen or are you not? And it's going to scare away people that could potentially be having some issues with being a legal status in the United States. And so they're less likely to answer, even if they're legal. There's a fear. And I remember working for campaigns back in Orange County when we were going to Chapman, and there were a lot of Latino doors we knocked on, and they just didn't want anything to do with it. And because there's somewhat of a fear. And so that brings up a question is how, like some of these states, even if these Latinos did answer the census or not, their population is growing, but are these people going to be represented in it? Or are these states going to, keep gerrymandering Republican districts that don't represent the people. And I think that might be one of the biggest like issues with this. And then mixing in the gerrymandering, especially in, legislatures that are controlled by Republicans in these states, it could be interesting.
So let's see. I had and you make a good point, and there is also a counter argument that I've heard, which I think does perhaps play into it. It's not the sole reason, but one is I think overall like that conversation of like adding that citizen question, and again that goes way deeper than it sounds. We did an episode on it, I believe, or at least mentioned it in an episode. But like you said, like you could have someone that is a legal citizen, but perhaps their family member in the same household is not. Then they would have to write that in the census that, hi, I'm a citizen, but they're not. And they were worried. People were worried that like, well, I might be fine, but I don't want to rat out, or risk any harm to my family members or anyone else in my household. But I also do think that the massive media conversation around it could also have also scared people too. I think it's fair to say when you have a massive conversation about should Latinos or should certain Latinos be scared of this question, perhaps they weren't until they heard that conversation. So that's a part of it as too. I will extend that part of it. But yeah, I mean it plays into both sides though. I mean I remember hearing that conversation and how the conversation was only around the democratic cities and states they're saying all this and they're worried about their Latino voters or whatever. And it's like, yeah, well, it actually prevented Arizona from getting a seat. Like, you're not counting people in Republican states that are Latino. And again, like we've had conversations before, why are you assuming that Latinos all vote Democrat? I mean, we're finding out that there's a lot of similarities, especially culturally, with like older conservative Catholic Latinos and the conservative party. So again, it's this weird thing where you're like, Republicans like don't want Latino voters, I guess, or don't want to count them, or at least perhaps that's the result of all that conversation on the census. And it doesn't always equal 1-to-1. Like this notion that that census thing will automatically eliminate Latino census counting and that'll hurt the Democrats. Like that's not always the case. And so, but that certainly has added that conversation that this census might be skewed on top of the pandemic, where a lot of especially really urban cities, like really dense cities, they had to completely do the census in different ways. They weren't allowed to just walk up to people's doors and hand them a census. I filled mine out in the mail, and I tell you, I almost forgot about it. I'll be honest, I almost forgot about it until I was like, oh shoot, like I saw some ad that's like, please fill out the census, and I was like, yeah, that's right, that's been sitting on my like mail pile by my kitchen for like 3 weeks, right? So yeah, I can see how people didn't fill it out. I could see how it's probably a tad inaccurate. I also understand how it's probably a tad inaccurate every time, but I have to imagine with the hyper-politicization of that one question on top of the limitations of the census workers in 2020, I can see how it would be perhaps inaccurate. And what we're seeing as a result of that is almost immediately after the results, there is litigation, there's lawsuits. And this is something that happens all the time, but we're seeing it now incredibly quickly. That the Democrats especially have already started lawsuits against the census redistricting in a lot of these states for that reason. They're claiming that the census was inaccurate.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's going to fly?
Which part, the lawsuits or?
Yeah, like do you think the lawsuits have any weight?
Yeah, I was actually looking into this because like, okay, to kind of answer that question, to go back to the lawsuits. They could technically, from what I gathered, they could do another census in 2025, but it would not impact congressional seats. But it could potentially be more accurate. But this was the most expensive census in U.S. history.
Wow.
I think it costed about $16 billion. I have the number here somewhere, but yeah, $15.6 billion. And so basically the Constitution is unclear about this, but there's a lot of legal experts, more on the left, that do think that they could do kind of a mid-decade census that would at least maybe give a better idea of the numbers in the country, though it wouldn't actually impact elections or anything like that. And the interesting thing to me though, and like, because yeah, I was working doing administrative work for an HOA where I live up in Tahoe during this last year, and I got calls and people coming in all the time complaining about census workers, because I'm near San Francisco, so you had definitely a lot of people super hyper aware about COVID, right? Mm-hmm. And so people that are more likely to probably want to maintain social distancing. And so I I was talking to people day in and day out about, being harassed by census workers, as they called it, because they're like, this is not good for a pandemic. They're like, I don't want someone showing up at my door, and that's what these people were doing. And so I agree with you. I could definitely see these numbers not being accurate. But then again, in a normal year, I don't know how much more accurate they actually are, to be
Right.
completely honest, because I think people are always lazy about doing this stuff. But obviously, between Trump's kind of rhetoric about this question, which, to be completely honest, I'm torn on, because I actually think that maybe it's not that controversial to have a citizenship question. I understand the side effects of it, like we've talked about.
Sure.
But I understand that. But with that question, and obviously Trump's kind of nationalistic, xenophobic tinge on things, with the pandemic, I could see how it would be inaccurate, because there is something interesting in the post. It said, I'm just going to read it here, is because it said each of those three states. Remember, I was talking about Texas, Florida, and Arizona, who have large percentage of Latino voters. It said Texas gained only 2 seats, Florida gained 1 seat, and Arizona gained none. As a result, these three states will send fewer members than expected to the House. And so I think that's the argument that I haven't articulated well, but is interesting, is that based on the percentage of Latinos in these three states, there should have actually been more seats
Right.
allocated.
Right.
And so it does show that there's issues, but then again, in the New York one, it seems to be the opposite, where it missed 89 people. Minnesota gained an extra seat because of that. Like, I don't know if you can say two things are true at the same time in this case. Like, could some states be overcounted and others undercounted? I don't know. Like, there's so many question marks, and the lawsuits, to me, may at least bring light to it. But to be completely honest, man, like, I don't really see there being much of a reaction to this, or any
No.
redo of this by any means.
I don't either. I think the lawsuits would have to show something seriously wrong. I kind of hear you. Like, I think the timing of that citizen question is kind of the worst part. Like, it was like really right before it. Like, it was like right before the census came out. They're like, oh, by the way, I think if it was like, hey, after this census from here on out, in the one in 2030, we're going to start including this. That gives people time to understand it, gives people time to, maybe more time to change their immigration status, right? Like, I think the timing of it was the worst part. But I also agree. I am skeptical that it was made it massively off. And I don't buy the argument that I see again on just like YouTube comments. Like, I was looking at YouTube comments, and both sides are going crazy over the census. And like, I see Democrats saying like, Trump rigged the census, we need to redo the whole thing. And I'm not sure. I don't buy that argument, again, because political analysts and scientists kind of guessed most of this. And again, like, they expected Texas to get a little bit more, actually, and they expected Arizona to pick up a seat, which it didn't. But they were like, but everything that happened kind of is in line with trends we've seen in our own data. So it doesn't tell me, like, I don't think it's super far off from what Trump. Hold on, give me 1 second. Shoot, there's just people outside.
No worries.
So I don't think it's that far off. Like, I don't think it's a major conspiracy that like Trump rigged the census. I don't buy that. And I also certainly don't buy the notion that, this census shows some massive red wave or something. Like, because you said, like, well, you're probably not even counting, like, you're probably not counting Latino voters in states. And again, you don't know if the people in these states are going to automatically vote Republican. So again, it's like, it's a more nuanced, hey, what do you know? It's more nuanced than people make it out to be. And then on top of that is, look, Oregon gained a seat. Minnesota gained a seat. Those are not Republican states by any means. So just because you see just because California loses a seat and Texas gains 2 does not mean that there's some like political paradigm shift of the American populace that's all going back to the Reagan era or something. I don't buy that at all. I think, like you said, I think the lawsuits will have to prove a lot. I don't think that they will get to the point of redoing a whole census. If they do, they do. Just like the election thing, though, let's just have to see what happens in court. I'm not going to assume anything until we see evidence shown in court, and we'll see if it holds up. The election stuff didn't hold up. This census stuff from the Democrats might not hold up. That's okay. We'll have another census in 2030. So that's kind of where I stand. Is I don't think Trump rigged it, but I also don't think it shows any kind of massive Republican shift.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree. And to be honest, to me, it's just, I think it again shows what we've been talking about kind of since the last election. is that, I mean, Democrats kind of have a upward battle in terms of the structural nature of our democracy.
Yes.
And Republicans, seem to kind of get lucky, even if something's not perfect for either side. They seem to get the benefit of the doubt, not in terms of like someone decides they need more seats, but just the system seems to be structurally more advantageous for Republicans. And I think we're seeing that. There was that special election in Texas. I think it was over the weekend, I want to say, and basically there was a lady named Representative Sanchez. Well, she's I don't have her first name here, so I apologize. But there's a lady named Sanchez who was running against the two Republicans in the district, and she came in third against two Republicans, and she's actually already withdrawn, and so there's going to be no runoff because it's two Republicans now. Yada yada yada, and kind of the takeaway from this, at least even in Politico was saying this, is it kind of shows that right now, even though Democrats are making ground in Texas, this new allocation of 2 seats for the state is probably only going to make things worse because this is actually a pretty Democratic district near Dallas Fort Worth, and 62% of the vote was Republicans and 37% was Democrat. And kind of their takeaway is that Texas is at an advantage to go back very strongly to the right, because motivating the base with Trump out of office is kind of difficult. The turnout's not going to be there, and now adding 2 seats to that is probably not going to help the case, and that's why the last thing I'll say there is just that I think that's why we haven't seen Republicans do an autopsy yet, to be completely honest, is because they're still banking on 2022 running on this kind of ethno-nationalist Trumpism. Like they haven't actually lost that much in the long term yet. They obviously lost the election to Biden and pretty much every branch of power possible, but I think they're still saying maybe this is our Hail Mary here in 2022. And so I think that this census has helped them, though it's not like finalizing anything for them. And I think it's going to be after 2022 that we're maybe going to see the GOP actually adjust or look in the mirror.
Yeah, that's a good call. It certainly does help the Republicans, but it's not indicative of a long-term success. It's a short-term one, and the midterms are going to be an interesting barometer. I think they will take the House back, but by how much, I don't know. And for how long, we'll see. And, of course, a multitude of issues can come up before then. But, yeah, this is what I was talking about months ago with the rubber banding. We saw Texas get really close. And as excited I got I got to see Texas go a little purple. I was like, look, guys, this is a Trump thing. It's gonna rubber band back. The idea that Texas will be fully blue by 2026, bro, no way, man. And now that we've seen the census results, it kind of solidifies that Texas got a little blue because the Republican candidate was absolutely batshit crazy. But now we're back to normalcy. Texas is red. Texas is still red, guys. And it's probably going to be that way for a little bit longer now that they got 2 more seats. But anyway, it just goes to show that the census is something super complex. I have thought that perhaps maybe we should do the census more often, like maybe every 5 years. Like I know that you said that there's that weird legal thing where they could do it in the 5-year point but not redistrict. I could see us just doing it every 5 years in general. Maybe that's too expensive. I don't know. But
it would be too expensive.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, man. I mean, we it sounds like we probably spend 10 times that much on one aircraft carrier. But anyway,
that's fair.
Just to say though that like the census is complex. This does have political ramifications. Democrats are probably worried. I mean, we see that with the litigations coming out. But I do think that Democrats were super worried in 2010. After 2010, they lost a ton of seats. The Republicans gained a ton of seats, and yet, Barack Obama had a second term. Democrats have been doing pretty well in presidential races, at least over a long time. It's interesting to see. I think the short-term effects, Republicans are in favor, but the long-term effects are the jury's out.
Yeah, man. And, before we're out of here, I just wanted to mention it because I think it's something that I'm just really, really quickly curious on your take, because it's something in the census that I think actually could be a bipartisan problem that the U.S. gets to face going forward. It's population decline. Like this census showed that for the first time, from what I'm seeing in U.S. history, I listened to a great, New York Times Daily podcast today just on it, and they were talking about how teenage women and women in their 20s are just not having kids.
Yeah.
And the birth rate is just dramatically declining. And basically there's 2 like kind of theories on this. One is that, economic implications, right? Like the economy, no one has kids during it. It's normal during a recession or whatever we had the last year to not have kids. But the other side of it is that maybe like it's just a showing of how society's changing. Women are more intertwined in the labor market, in the economy, less willing to stay home and have kids. And the worrying thing is that our immigration system is, we've let in less people about for the last couple of years in a row, and we're having less kids. And they kind of call it this inverted pyramid, where over time, like there's not going to be enough people to pay for the social safety nets that we need. And this problem's not just in the US, like even in Scandinavia, this New York Times study looked at, like the birth rate's going down too. And Scandinavia has amazing social networks. They have great protection for paid leave, and still the birth rate is down. And so their worry is that we cannot compete with countries like China if this keeps happening. So I don't know. I think it's something that was not really mentioned enough in the census, but our population is stagnating, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing personally.
True.
I think for the environment, we need to stop. But that's just my own weird personal belief. I don't see it as an issue. I see it as, you're right. That's absolutely an issue for our institutions and our
Yeah.
and that's why we need to take a good look at how we fund things, and maybe. Maybe don't tie healthcare to employers, or maybe, I don't know, maybe have a generational wealth tax. I don't know. That's a controversial topic, but I have seen the same thing, right? And the reality is, one is the pandemic. We've seen a massive baby bust, the opposite of a boom, a massive baby bust because of the pandemic. I understand that people don't want to bring a child into the world when you're stressed about surviving in the next week, and your job was lost because you worked in the tourism industry, right? Why would you want to bring a kid into this world? And then on top of that, I think in general, cultural shifts with my generation, millennials and below. I think now even Gen Zers are getting to like age of having kids, like early 20s. And we don't want kids. Well, I think there's just a cultural difference between generations. And then I think on top of the economic realities is, the fact that wages haven't changed at all. The fact that my dad made the same wage as me at my age in the 80s, but the standard of living has gone up 4 times since then. So yeah, we're making the same pay, but I couldn't afford a house with 2 kids right now. Especially in California, no way. So yeah, why would I want a kid if that's just going to literally put me in debt for 18 years? I think that's Japan's in the same boat. You mentioned Scandinavia. It's something to be. I guess it's a weird thing, but I see the problem, but I don't want to be the change to fix it. The change to fix it would be then I should just have a bunch of kids, and hell no, man, come on. I don't know. I don't know what you wanted from me.
No, I mean, absolutely, man. And yeah, I actually think just the pragmatic approach to it would be that maybe the view of what the U.S.'s role in the world will change. We've always been this one with just an influx of people, growth, and maybe the U.S. is no longer growing. And I agree with you. The one positive thing is, just to cap that off, is that China did their census, in 2020 as well. And the Chinese government tried to cover it up now. But the Chinese census showed the same thing. Population decline. Younger people are not having kids. China's freaking out because it was in 2025 they thought that was going to happen. It's early. And I think you're right. It shows a cultural shift. I think actually pornography and all these other things also are not helping. I think younger people just don't have sex as much, to be completely honest. And with education and the pandemic and contraceptives, just kind of everything put together, it's probably a trend that's going to be here to stay. And you're right. Unless you're a very lucky millennial, it'd be hard to afford a house and 2 kids and all that bullshit. So yeah.
Yeah. I think the last thing is, I think it's a little off topic, but it does make me think that if we're declining population, then I think we should be more willing to open up immigration. I think people forget that the periods of large economic boom in America have also come hand in hand with large immigration swells. Turn of the century, post World War II. I mean, big economic booms were accompanied by immigration booms. It's not, and so I think this idea that immigration will somehow be a drag on our economy is and threaten our population is actually it's completely the opposite. I think it would be beneficial for American economy to allow immigration, especially if that's the case, especially if like, our population is declining. We literally just need more people to pay into the system so that we can have our social welfare. Then let's get more people to pay into the system. I mean, I don't know what the hell. But it's kind of
totally
a different topic, but yeah.
No, I mean, there is one thing that we can just full circle back to the census here is that immigration's down. Still minorities from one way or another are being undercounted. And we do need to have a conversation about what the future of our country is. And so a census is crucial. I agree with you that it should probably happen more frequently, because I don't think every 10 years is really a great way to keep tabs on the population. But again, it's expensive and there's political issues on both sides of it. I don't think New York was screwed, 89 seats, Minnesota gained them. I don't know, but you're right. I think there's a conversation about population because it comes in these cycles. We do need people, like countries need people to work, especially if your population is aging. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. The census, the census is going to be controversial. I could see there being a conversation about trying to redo it, especially as how divided we are for different reasons. But time will tell with that one. Yeah, anyways, you guys can find us as usual on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I guess iTunes. I don't know if they really do podcasts anymore. All those third-party sites, YouTube, here on Twitch, usually Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And let us know your thoughts. Was the census accurate? Was it not? Are you happy to see these shifts? Are you moving to Texas? I heard Austin's cool. I don't know. But yeah, let us know. Take care, guys.
Bye. All right, that's that episode done.
Sweet. I'm going to run to the Banyo.
Are you able to hear conversation in the background, by the way, or no?
No, I actually don't hear anything.
Okay, great. Good.
I once, like the time when you like closed your window, I heard, like a couple voices for like a millisecond, but that was it.
Okay, cool. That's good. Yeah, so we're good then.
Yeah, you're fine. It was almost the same as like that one time you had like a police car go by.
Yeah,
that was pretty much the same thing. Yeah.
All right. We'll get started in a sec.
Cool. 1 second.
Hey, Kirby, stop crying. Do you think the super strong population decline will affect Social Security? Yeah, I do. That's why, yeah, absolutely. And we already have, they're in that position now where they think, oh, hi. Where they think that, like, the current baby boomers are all becoming retirement age and getting into that system, and it's going to be a big draw. That's why I don't think it's an issue to allow people to become American citizens easier, to then pay into the system, reap the benefits, but also pay in. I mean, like literally, like Japan is about to have this, like, for lack of a better term, on crack, because there's so little babies being born and so many old people in Japan that their social security like system is going to take a huge toll, and they're like literally telling kids like, please have babies, please. But they don't allow a lot of immigration in Japan. It's hard to immigrate to Japan. So I personally just think allow people to become citizens, allow people, get them to pay taxes, get them involved, and that would help. Yo, what up, dude?
What is up? That is a great question. Do you think that a super strong population will affect Social Security? Yes.
We were just talking a little bit about that. All right, so sick. So let's do wedge issues. The least controversial topic we could think of. All the topics that make people upset.
Oh, good.
All right. Do you want me to intro this one?
Porfa.
Okay, let me get rid of this stuff that I don't need here. Dan Crenshaw's 2nd Congressional District. Yeah, that's a wild one.
It looks like they just found all the wealthy suburbs and just left out the inner parts, unfortunately. And that's probably why he maybe has an out-of-touch view on some things, because his voters are,
Yeah, and I saw his average income of his district was $80,000. So he's a pretty wealthy part of suburban Houston, I would imagine. A wedge issue. Okay, cool. So, you ready?
Yes, sir.
All right. Recording in 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tonic Accord podcast. Today we are talking about wedge issues and some of the ones we find the weirdest, some of the ones we find that most make sense, and the most controversial. But we're going to talk about what is a wedge issue and some of the wedge issues we see in American politics and how they've maybe changed over time. So let's dive in. So to start out, I'm going to give a definition here from Wikipedia. A wedge issue is a political or social issue, often of a controversial or divisive nature, which splits apart a demographic or population group. Wedge issues are often applied, to split Democrats and Republicans, like where they are, or to make independents choose a side. They really are forcing you to, drive a wedge in between a group of people and force you on a side. The idea is that, most often wedge issues lack nuance. I think a lot of people find it's either one way or another. And there's this notion of the law of the excluded middle. And that's a super interesting, logic way of thinking that basically says, and it's very simply, a statement is either true or it is false. There is no in between. And if you're on paper, that makes sense, right? Equals A or equals B, and A cannot equal B, right? But we know from living in society that is not always the case. You can't just exclude the middle. A statement is not always 100% false or 100% true. And that's where wedge issues come in. Wedge issues try and force you to choose this law of the excluded middle, where in reality, there's a lot in the middle. So what's your take on wedge issues, Alex?
Well, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean it. But,
no, go ahead.
But yeah, I have to say wedge issues are one of the things, I knew examples of them, but I never really looked into an actual definition of them. And in preparation for this podcast, it's been actually kind of nice to learn about, wedge issues on both sides in a lot of ways, and kind of the history of it, and this the law of the excluded middle, excuse me, like you said. And, for me, this actually sums up my issue I have talking with both Republicans and Democrats, is because I land pretty much in the middle on a lot of issues. And I've found it hard to have a nuanced conversation on something like, transgender athletes or abortion or guns,
right,
or, whatever else it may be, cancel culture, because I try to, if I'm talking to a conservative, I want to bring nuance to it, or a Democrat the same. And I found that we've kind of started using simple terms and simple labels to kind of just cast people into two groups. And I mean, honestly, man, wedge issues, I think, are antithetical to our podcast, obviously, because we like to dive into the nuance of things. But I think wedge issues in general appeal to kind of the monkey brain in all of us, kind of the just need to cast out opposition and just go with an idea. And it just seems like, I think it was that Atlantic article we were both reading, is it kind of talks about how the losing side is usually the one that drums up wedge issues to gain support. And to me, the Republicans have kind of become the party of wedge issues. Not all wedge issues are the same. Some, I think, actually have been beneficial, like maybe potential civil rights in the 60s. But then at the same time, other ones like gun control, abortion, transgender sports, all that jazz, masks. There's stuff that you kind of have to pick a side, and a lot of people haven't, and it just kind of divides society. So that's my kind of initial take on it, is that I think wedge issues are here to stay, but I don't know if they're effective in actually creating a healthy country.
Right. That's a very good analysis. I'm in the same boat. Like, wedge issues are those things that bring people into politics that perhaps did not have a side before. I think that's one of the main things. Like, I actually have a really good quote here about, the political strategy around wedge issues. It is not to, it is to force people to choose a side. It's to bring people into the fold and force them in. So, like for example, you could have independents in the middle that, maybe I'm a little, socially liberal, economic conservative. I don't know. I'm just kind of an average Joe. But then you force them, hey, man, but they'll never take your guns, right? You'll never absolutely take your guns. And I'll always have my guns. And then boom, they're a Republican. Even though on other things they might have been, more nuanced and stuff. If you drive a certain issue home that really divides people, like gun control or abortion, It can put people into a basket that they never then leave. I know personally people that will never ever change their opinion on abortion. Ever. There is nothing I can say, there is nothing I can do that will change their opinion on abortion. It is just driven home, often based in religious belief, that is such a wedge issue that they will never be driven to the other side. The wedge is so strong. And that kind of thing can retain voters even if they feel that the best example is Donald Trump. So many people I feel might have been like, I don't like Donald Trump. He's a slimy businessman, but he's pro-life. He's pro-life, and I can never vote for a pro-choice candidate. That is the best example of a wedge issue, driving someone that perhaps was on the sidelines before, or in between, in the middle. That was, but this one issue, if he's pro-life and he's pro-choice, I have to go with this guy. So that's kind of what we're talking about for those that are still a bit confused on wedge issues. And often it's to drive people that, we're not talking about people that were already hardcore MAGA hats or already hardcore, I worked for Planned Parenthood for 40 years. We're talking about people that might not be politically active at all, but they hear about this one issue and now they suddenly pick a side. And so, so some of the big ones, like you said, was an interesting one, which we know that Atlantic article talked about, which was the Civil Rights Act. How the Civil Rights Act, before the Civil Rights Act, Democrats, there was Democrats in the South, Democrats in the North, but there was a strong Democratic base in the South that was white Southern Democrats. After the Civil Rights Act, it drove a wedge in that population group. It pushed minorities in the South to the Democratic Party, hey, look, they're looking out for my civil rights. Whereas it pushed white Southern Democratic voters to the Republican Party. It literally drove a wedge in a voting bloc, a pretty safe one. The Southern Democrats was a safe voting bloc for a while until the Civil Rights Movement and the Southern strategy came apart. And so that's an interesting one where, obviously I think you'd be insane to look back and be against the Civil Rights Act. But we all know that was a good thing in the long run. But that's a good example of that's still a wedge issue that literally split a voting bloc. Some others that abortion, huge. Gun rights in America, huge. But I wanted to get into some that we're seeing today that perhaps, people not might realize are wedge issues. And you had mentioned, transgender athletes. The idea that a transgender woman would still be born with the male sex, might have male physicality with muscles and stuff like that, and might have an advantage over female athletes. This is an issue that certainly I understand that there's concern about. I can see why people on either side would want to be invested in this kind of thing. But the reality is, I think that it's not necessarily a huge problem. The reality is it's not even the biggest problem facing the transgender community, right? I think if you're talking about transgender rights, athletes is, I think, way below the idea that transgender women are way higher, way more likely to be murdered. Way less likely to get the correct health care that they require. These are all more important things than this one wrestling match in a high school. Okay, I understand why the people involved in that high school might be concerned, but it's become such an issue on a global, national scale, that it's driving a wedge. It's now become a cultural issue where it's you're either and you can hear the rhetoric all the lefties just want Mike Tyson to be able to beat up women. You're oh my God, dude. Or the other thing, it's on the other hand, it's if someone's concerned about the fairness of their sports event, then you're suddenly so transphobic and hateful and bigoted. And it's guys, this issue, frankly, is not that important. It probably affects a couple hundred people total in the whole country. It's certainly not the biggest issue with sports. It's certainly not the biggest issue with transgender rights, but it's become a wedge.
Absolutely. And very well said, because, that's the issue, is that I think the nuanced conversation would be transgender individuals are seeing hate crimes on the rise. They are seeing, discrimination in public places involving bathrooms, work,
right,
etc. Right. And a lot of these laws and these, pro-abortion bills that are going through different houses and different Congresses in different states, they're not about making sure that a transitioned male, let's just say, can now fight in women's sports. But the problem is that if you're just an average person, like you said, like the people that usually aren't involved in politics, if you see Tucker Carlson saying they're going to make trans men run our military, or Mike Tyson's going to be fighting the transitioned Ronda Rousey or something, like, and the problem is two things can be true at once here. Like, I think there's a conversation to be had about, like, say, like MMA or football.
Absolutely.
Like, but that's, but again, that's not the conversation that's being had, but it divides everyone. And again, like, I've had issues trying to explain to both sides this, where I'm like, I'll call you by whatever pronoun you want. I will treat you exactly how you want. And I support everyone living better in the United States. And I don't think that should be completely separated from the fact that I do think that there's a conversation to be had about sports.
Right.
But the problem is that's way too nuanced for this conversation. And
Exactly.
there's a great Hill article that talked about basically, in the 1970s, after kind of the civil rights era, Watergate, all this pretty much bad stuff for Republicans. The party thought they were done. Wages were stagnating, jobs were declining, inequality was growing, and you kind of saw this evangelical movement on the right. Reagan only was really able to win because they politicized guns and religion. And those two things, I think, really changed the Republican Party, especially. And now the left has their own problems, believe me. But it seems like the right since the 70s has become kind of focused on these wedge issues, which the Hill calls the trifecta: guns, abortion, and identity. And to me, the trans thing is, again, like, yeah, they're talking about sports, but I again think it goes back to, is this the America you want to live in? It goes back to this bigger sense on the right. The Tucker Carlson's talking about this frequently. And right. To me, it's like, I don't know how we get past that, but the trans one, I think, is just the latest iteration of that problem, because I always think about guns. Guns is a big one for me because it's become the left wants to get rid of guns, according to the messaging on the right, or the left says, the right wants to give everyone assault rifles or whatever it may be. To me, it's become just, there's no nuance to it, where basically if you support guns, you cannot support democratic politicians involving guns. And it's like, okay, the idea of background checks. Close to 90% of Americans support some form or another of background checks. But then again, if you asked a Republican, they would probably still vote against background checks if they actually had to, in public or whatever, because there's this idea of, it's either they're going to get rid of guns or they're going to keep your gun rights. And it's just unhealthy. It's really unhealthy.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, too, is like, yeah, look at all the school shootings we've had. Like, we should absolutely have a nuanced conversation around gun control. But people aren't willing to have that. It's either, you're a gun-toting gun nut, or you're a, government overthrow, steal your guns liberal that wants to live in a hippie commune. It's like, dude, I personally know plenty of people that are firearms owners, responsible firearms owners, that vote left, that vote liberal, like that meme, like, we exist. But like they do exist. There are people on the left that support gun rights. There's also people that own guns that support gun control. Right, there are people that are firearms owners that are like, yeah, I don't think I should be able to have a grenade launcher. Yes. So yeah, but you're right that the NRA, if you look at like the messaging from the NRA, their ads are not about, hey, look at the data that supports safe and responsible gun ownership. No, their ads are like full-blown propaganda, like, Bernie Sanders is going to burn down your house and take your guns and put up a communist flag. You're like, oh my God, dude. So yeah, a massive wedge issue. I think another one today is cancel culture, which again it's not a new issue. I think the issue is something that happens all the time with cultural in-groups and cultural out-groups. And then 20 years ago, I mean, even 10 years ago, but 10 through 30 years ago, it was just called political correctness. In fact, I think it was in the beginning of the 90s, in 1992, when that term really hit the election cycle, which it was, people were like, are you going to be dominated by political correctness, right? And now it's this, today we call it cancel culture. Matt Gaetz, the alleged sex offender, is now saying that that's a result of cancel culture, that he's been investigated by the DOJ. And you're like, what? Like, and now it's so obviously just a buzzword meant to wedge people on a side. Whereas it's like, well, Okay, well, let's actually break it down what we're talking about. We're talking about in-groups and out-groups and societal change and perhaps societies valuing things differently than society valued before. Bill Maher is somewhere shaking. Yeah, again, that's a good example of someone who is on the left and is completely wedged by this thing. He thinks cancel culture is like the biggest sin of our modern day. And it's like, okay, maybe, man. I feel like you still have a show on HBO, as far as I can tell. But I think that's another one where it's not necessarily a new issue, but it's being redefined in a new way to wedge people onto a certain position.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I would say for Bill Maher, just because I always get defensive with him because he's probably my favorite political comedian. I would say that he's not a wedge guy with cancel culture. He's more worried about kind of both sides' form of cancel culture. So from what I've seen, he's more of a nuanced guy who's just talking about the long-term effects of this idea of restricting controversy. But I understand where I totally get where you're going with that. But yeah, no, I mean, with free speech and cancel culture, absolutely. And see, the right has actually, I think, done something somewhat genius, is that they basically have started saying that, social media companies and many prominent liberals want to ban free speech. And free speech is one of those toxic terms where you don't want to ban it, right? Like,
Right.
we live in the United States, democracy, the Constitution. Like, we're one of those beacons on the hill. I think that beacon might have gone out, but anyways, like, it seems like you're either against or for free speech, especially according to like the Fox News talking heads, and which is not the reality. Like
No.
you said, it's kind of the in-group out-group dynamics, and some of these views should be thrown in the dustbin of history. But that's where we're at right now. Is that like I would push back just a little bit on the Bill Maher thing, is because he's more looking at just these more ridiculous like college campuses. Like, he's more focused on the culture of mainly Gen Z, who almost on the other way find dangerous views toxic or controversial views toxic. And he's just saying we need controversy sometimes and ideas. But
That's valid. That's valid. But he harps on cancel culture a lot, right? And I think it's taken on a larger entity than it is. It actually takes up in the real day-to-day affecting, like the idea of cancel culture is bigger than the actual effects people think it has on people's lives. Like, do you know what I'm trying to mean? Like, I don't disagree that, yeah, like Bill Maher does make good points. I mean, he's obviously the kind of guy that is like known for controversial takes and known for being like at the edge of comedy. So of course he's going to be against cancel culture and whatever that means to him. And yeah, like again, I'm not denying that he might make some good nuanced points, but I think it's just to bring like light to like people give this idea of cancel culture so much weight, whereas in reality, I don't think it has much weight in your day-to-day life. And that's what a wedge issue is. That's what a wedge issue is it's something that like before you had thought about it, it actually doesn't affect you that much, but now it brings you into the fold of political discussion and forces you to a side. And again, like let's say, like you said, I would agree that Republicans politically have almost mastered the ability to use wedge issues to drive people to their party. But that's not to say that the Democrats haven't done that as well. I mean, I think that like look at the senators with the minimum wage issue. The whole idea of like, you're not a Democrat unless you support the minimum wage. And I do support increasing the minimum wage. I do hope that senators like Joe Manchin go there. But like it's driving a wedge. It drove a wedge between, moderate Democrats and progressive Democrats to the point where Kristen Sinema did a whole giant thumbs down thing or whatever as like a show or whatever. So like it certainly does happen on the left as well. That whole idea of like, canceling Mr. Potato Head, Dr. Seuss. That's a wedge issue that I think both sides are just so ridiculously obsessed with. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and that whole, like, if you look at the rhetoric on Fox News about the cancelization of Dr. Seuss, which came from the Dr. Seuss's family, by the way. But like, yeah, the idea of trying to cancel things and make us feel uncomfortable, and then the reaction to it being that we shouldn't cancel anything that makes us uncomfortable. I think it's all ridiculous. Why are we even talking about Mr. Potato Head at all? Right? How is this an issue that affects anyone in real life? It doesn't. It literally does not affect anyone's day-to-day life, and yet has become such an important topic of discussion. That's the wedge.
Oh, yeah, that's actually a really good point. And again, I think more specifically on the right, it's become somewhat of just a way to keep some semblance of staying in touch with power. Like because I don't think the right has really had many options or policies since kind of the Tea Party, and so it's easier to talk about Mr. Potato Head than try to actually give alternatives to the Affordable Care Act, for
Oh,
example.
good point.
Um, and to me, there's an issue though that actually kind of terrifies me is that our country's so divided. To me, words like English words, have become kind of a symptom of wedge issues. And I'll elaborate what I mean. So, like, there's kind of a deterioration of language, where our buddy Thucydides, the
Mm,
Thucydides trap guy,
yeah.
he said that basically during strange, divisive times, language is essentially raped. And also George Orwell had that book Politics and the English Language, and he talks about how political orthodoxies and the debasement of language can actually influence how people behave or react to words. And to me, it seems like words don't mean what they used to. I watched Mitt Romney get booed out of Utah a couple days ago by the Republican Party of Utah, being called a communist. The, the term communist has nothing to do with Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
He's a rich business owner. And so what does communist mean? It means an outsider who's against Trump. Then I think about the term fascist on the left.
Yeah.
I've been called personally a fascist by someone because I disagreed with some of their economic policies.
Right.
And so if they looked up what fascist means, it's not what they're calling me.
No.
But over time, these words are just kind of part of the wedge issue. It's like you're either communist or you're not. Calling Romney a communist doesn't mean he is one. But what happens when he wants to now pass a policy on the right? Do the Republicans vote with him if he's now labeled a communist by their culture and the media? Like, to me, it's just become this weird ass thing going on where it's these words that have been misused and changed that are actually like driving this wedge culture that I think is going to go spiraling out of control at some point.
Yeah, or like everything, like any form of government assistance is now socialism. Like you literally can't have a government spending program that helps people without being labeled as socialist. And you're like, oh my god, like what's even like you said, eventually like, words lose their meaning, or like actually more eloquently put, the meaning changes. Like that was a really good example of communist doesn't mean that Mitt Romney supports means a change in the ownership of means of production. It means that you just don't like Trump, so we don't like you. And that's a wedge. That's a new wedge issue. Are you a Trump Republican or not? That's a whole wedge in its own Republican Party. I mean, that's a great example because we're literally seeing a civil war within the Republican Party because of this. Look at Meghan McCain versus Kevin McCarthy right now. Yeah, that's a really good point. I also wanted to mention, why would a party want to do this? Why would a party want to create all these issues that may have actually no semblance of changing any voter's day-to-day life? And one thing is like it drums up support, and there's a little bit of evidence to support that. The Pew Research Center, and this is old, granted, it's a big grain of salt. This is from 2006, but they looked at the 2004 elections and how Bush did better he really pushed a vote to ban, like there was a statewide vote to ban gay marriage, I believe in like 11 states, and Bush did better in those states that had that wedge issue on the ballot while he was also on the ballot. So to explain this a little bit better is that if you have a wedge issue like, are we voting to ban gay marriage? A lot of religious people feel very strongly about gay marriage, being against it, that is. And so the idea was maybe Bush, the Republican candidate who also wants to ban gay marriage, maybe he'll do better if we put that wedge issue on the poll. So people that were religious but might not be like Bush fans would actually show up to the polls because now they have this wedge issue, and if they're already there, might as well vote for the guy that also wants to ban gay marriage, right? So it's this idea that a wedge issue could actually drive out voters to you that wouldn't normally be there before. And even people on the other side of the aisle, Bush did better in those states with the wedge issue among black voters who were also religious. Whereas in the states that did not have the wedge issue to ban gay marriage, Bush did about the same amongst blacks that went to church between 2000 and 2004. So there's this idea that wedge issue actually helped Bush in those 11 states. And so that is why they want politicians and their parties want to get wedge issues on the ballot at the same time as their candidate, because it might drive people to go in and vote for him.
That's a very good point. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like we've seen somewhat of an acceleration of that, where there's kind of this feedback loop where Fox News, for example, creates somewhat of a fear, and then the people that watch whatever news outlet it may be then feel a strong reaction to support whatever that said topic was. You know what I mean? So if you have something like abortion or the border or criminal justice or transgender sports or masks,
Masks.
if you've been lied to, right, then you are probably going to then feel like you need to go out and support the said lie. And yeah, it's interesting to see, and like I could imagine that marijuana actually on the left would probably be a similar issue, just because it's kind of an issue that will get people out there, right?
Right.
Like the Biden Harris administration, like when they were running, they did talk about that being a center stone. Biden's White House did kick people out for testing positive, but that's a whole other thing. But but yeah, like I think that like it's important just to appeal to people if they have a narrative or a belief in their head and to get them out. So I think that's a really good point. And now I if you're down, I think we should just get into the COVID tree.
Yeah.
Because I think COVID's almost created its own like flow chart
of wedge issues. Yes.
Yes.
It's like 4 coming out of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I mean, what do you think? Let's start with vaccines, because I think vaccines and masks are kind of these two different trees you could go off on. So vaccine passport, Drew. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's an issue that hasn't even like really started yet. Like I think it's only been adopted by Hawaii for international travel. To use a vaccine passport. Only a few countries around the world are using vaccination requirements to enter into like public buildings. Like I think Israel's one of them. I'm trying to find that. Denmark, Estonia, and Israel have launched passports that grant vaccinated individuals access to restaurants. That's 3 countries, right? What we're seeing is vaccination passports are the requirements to move around or do things to have a vaccine is actually not that big. It's not that huge, and yet the conversation around it is much larger. And then like this, you pulled up this article that Republicans are like banning businesses from requiring proof of vaccination, which I think should end up in lawsuits because of the whole "we have a right to refuse service to anyone" thing. So that'll obviously get challenged if it's not already. But yeah, like it's. The whole talk about freedom and stuff like this, like it's like a wedge issue that, guys, all you have to do is just get a vaccination and wait like 6 months. We will be back to normal. But it's becoming this greater conversation around freedom and my rights and I don't. Again, it's just like the masks thing. Like the mask thing has become such a cultural identity issue. And wedging people against each other, where it's like it's just a public health thing, and really and as we're finding out, the CDC is lessening the restrictions. Like things are actually changing back to normal. Like chill out, everybody, chill out.
Yeah. so yeah. I mean, first off, I was in In-N-Out a couple weeks ago, and I was talking to the gentleman who works there who opens the door, and he said he had to help break up a fight between someone wearing a mask and another person not wearing a mask. And the person wearing a mask, told the person not wearing a mask, hey, can you either step back or put on a mask? And that person got aggressive. And to me, that just sums up this wedge issue perfectly.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, like I think you and I talked about this a little bit last week, is like I wear a mask when I'm around people when I'm inside. If I'm out running by myself, I don't.
Yeah.
Like, to me, it should be that simple. But the fact that I think the CDC has to clarify so frequently means that there are so many people that are just completely against all of it. And, it's just like COVID has been this issue it's been a giant wedge issue, because it's basically like you have people that think it's serious and then people that think it's government oppression, like a manufactured problem to oppress your citizens. And like on the vaccine passport, man, like, yeah, you said it well, is like, you can't, like, it's, to me, it's antithetical of being a conservative or Republican or whatever they are now, to basically be like, yeah, we're going to force private businesses to not allow something. Like, what are you actually trying to do? Like, I thought private institutions were supposed to be on their own and make decisions that benefit everyone. I think that some of these people that are so, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who called it the mark of the beast, it's like, you have a selective memory, because if you have kids, they have to, they have to have a vaccine to go to school.
Yeah.
If you're traveling to certain countries, you need to have yellow fever and malaria and all these other, records. And from what I've gathered, there's no intent of needing vaccine passports. It would be unconstitutional to say you can't travel from Minnesota to Wisconsin, for example. It's not legal. It's not constitutionally acceptable. Like, all they're talking about is giant public gatherings. But again, that's not the information that the people who are against vaccines are getting. They're getting, it's a wedge issue that's trying to obstruct your freedom. And it quite frankly pisses me off, because like, and the irony is like states like Utah and Texas, like Ron DeSantis wants to prevent businesses from requiring proof of vaccination. Sure, that's fine, but public schools, public buildings, they still, if they're federal or even their own thing, they can still do it. Like, it's unconstitutional. And so it's just created this whole issue. And I think vaccines are a perfect wedge issue, mainly because you can't kind of take the vaccine, right? Like, you can't say, hey, I want like a quarter of a dose or something. Like, you take it or you don't. So it divides the country perfectly. Either you take it or you don't. And I don't think that's good for a freaking global pandemic.
Yeah. And if you're just if you're like if you're just like not that well informed and maybe just sitting on the sidelines of politics, but you're like sketched out about vaccines, and then you hear some misinformation, and then you see it linked to Tucker Carlson, that's how it happens. Is you were not interested in politics before, an issue comes up where that does interest you, and then you are wedged to one side. And like, I'm sure that's happening. I mean, Donald Trump is the perfect example of the biggest wedge issue is himself, and then he also effectively utilized wedge issues to drive people to his support, to his base. There's so many people that were like, yeah, I wasn't involved in politics before Trump, but then, I heard one thing or this one problem, and he spoke to me directly about one thing, and then now they're full-blown QAnon on everything. And it's like, that you get brought into the fold. I could see how someone who's like a little sketched about vaccines watches one video that's anti-vax, and then now they go down that rabbit hole, and now they are right-wing Tucker Carlson watching Republicans. That's what wedge issues are designed to do. They are designed to bring support from people that normally you didn't have it from before. It's designed to divide, and that's why it is unhealthy. Now, some things are divisive for good reasons, like we mentioned, right? Like we mentioned the Civil Rights Act. That was divisive because a lot of people were racist and didn't want people to have civil rights. That is divisive. It's a good wedge issue. But a lot of them, most wedge issues are not beneficial to society, usually miss the mark on what affects people's day-to-day lives, and are just driven to, just designed to drive support to one way or another.
Definitely. And, just I guess if we were talking about how to maybe like calm down all this kind of like divisive wedged tension, would be to muddle the waters. Like, to be completely honest, like, because these wedge issues are so black and white, you need to kind of mix up those colors and make it gray.
Yeah, let's look at the nuance. Let's get gray. Let's get gray up in here.
And I think Biden, again, could be the president to do it, because he's like ideologically pretty moderate, but policy-wise pretty progressive. And maybe his just messaging and image could maybe say, hey, it's okay if you're a Christian, if you have diverging views on abortion, or it's okay to disagree on the extent of transgender rights in the military or sports. It's okay to disagree, but you have to give people opposing ideas, and to do that, we're stuck in these echo chambers. I don't even know how we do. So yeah, I don't really have a solution, just ideas.
Yeah. Well, all this is to say, I mean, it's just I'm just glad we talked about it, because I don't think people even know what a wedge issue is, and yet I bet you they talk about them all the time, right? People don't realize how much of what they think of their perception of the world and political discussion is shaped by others. You might think I came to this conclusion. It's like, but no, reality is a political strategist decided that was an effective wedge issue, probably polled hundreds and thousands of people to find out that a lot of people do get upset when talking about this issue. Decided on a narrative to pull you in, used a media propaganda apparatus to push that narrative out, and then now you think that thing. So it's like, oh, I have this free thought. I'm just a marble out in space finding thoughts. No, man, not really. Wedge issues are incredibly designed to pull you some way, and we're looking at the example. So that's all really what we're saying here is just out there. I'm not going to convince you on one way or another on abortion or gun control right now, but I do want to make you out there aware of what a wedge issue is, how they're being utilized in politics, and what you can do to identify them and perhaps take a step back and look at some more nuanced approaches. So I hope that was an informative and educational and a little bit fun and perhaps not too controversial of an episode of the Tonic Accord. You can find us at Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and Twitch. We live stream on YouTube and Twitch around 5 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday. So check us out there. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think about us. And thank you for watching.
Peace.
All right. And everyone in the stream, thank you for watching as well. Kirby Stump Carm, and as well as the others who have popped in and out, thank you for watching. Leave a follow if you enjoyed the content. Anything else before we head out, Alex?
Well, I mean, since there's a couple of people here, I would just say I'm actually terrified because a study shows that a majority of Americans believe the future will be bright. The only group that doesn't are Republicans, and I think that's a terrifying wedge issue of its own, is that the Republicans view the U.S. is going down the drain. And there's this kind of lack of hope and want to grow and be better on the right. And that to me is kind of scary.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I wonder though, if you polled the same group of people 2 years ago, I think a lot of Democrats would be like, yeah, this country's going down the shitter. And a lot of Republicans would be like, we're on the right track. So I'd be interested to see how that changes.
Fair, very fair. But yeah, that's all I got. But you're right. Yeah, it's just I just think there's a lack of wanting to support our democratic institutions on the right because I don't think they work.
I think January 6th is good evidence of that. All right, folks. Yeah, we're out of here. And yeah, stay tuned for the next episode.